In 1937, no carrier-based fighter on Earth could match a land-based opponent. The physics made it impossible. A carrier fighter had to be light enough to launch from a ship, strong enough to survive the shock of an arrested landing, and compact enough to fold its wings and descend into the hangar deck below. Every one of those requirements added weight or subtracted power. The result everywhere in the world was a compromise. Carrier fighters were slower than land-based fighters. They climbed worse. They turned wider. They carried less fuel. Every navy that operated aircraft carriers accepted this as a law of nature. The Americans accepted it. The British accepted it. The Japanese did not. In October 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a specification so extreme that one of the two companies invited to bid walked away from the table. The specification demanded a carrier fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver every land-based fighter in the world while carrying two 20mm cannon, two 7.7mm machine guns, a full radio set, a direction finder for navigation, and enough fuel to fly for 6 to 8 hours at economical cruising speed. 8 hours. A round trip of over 1,500 miles from a ship in the middle of the Pacific to a target and back. No fighter on Earth had that range. No carrier fighter came close to that speed. The wingspan had to stay under 12 milliseconds, so the aircraft could fit on a carrier elevator. The Navy wanted the fighter to climb to 3,000 pounds in 3.15 minutes. It wanted a maximum speed of 500 km/h. It wanted maneuverability equal to or better than the A5M, the fighter it was replacing, which was already the most agile carrier aircraft in the world. The men who wrote the specification were not engineers. They were naval officers who had watched their pilots fight over China and concluded that the next war would be fought across distances so vast that a short-range fighter was useless, regardless of how fast it flew. They wanted a machine that violated the known limits of aircraft design. They sent the specification to Nakajima and to Mitsubishi. Nakajima's engineers studied the numbers, concluded they were physically impossible, and withdrew from the competition in January 1938. At Mitsubishi, one engineer looked at the same numbers and saw a way through. His name was Jiro Horikoshi. He was 34 years old. The company he worked for was not a small workshop. Mitsubishi was an empire. Yataro Iwasaki, a former samurai from Tosa Province, had founded it in 1870 as a shipping company. He had leveraged government contracts, strategic ruthlessness, and the chaos of the Meiji Restoration to build a conglomerate that touched every sector of the Japanese economy. By the 1930s, the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was one of the 4 largest industrial groups in Japan alongside Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. It built ships, it mined coal, it manufactured steel, glass, paper, and electrical equipment. It ran banks, insurance companies, and trading houses. It owned real estate across Tokyo, and it built airplanes. In 1920, Mitsubishi had established the Mitsubishi Internal Combustion Engine Company to manufacture aircraft engines. That company became Mitsubishi Aircraft in 1928. In 1934, Mitsubishi Aircraft merged with Mitsubishi Shipbuilding to form Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which by the late 1930s was the largest private company in Japan. Its aircraft division operated out of the Nagoya Works, a sprawling manufacturing complex in central Honshu. The Nagoya plant built bombers for the Navy and fighters for the Army. It employed thousands of engineers and assemblers. The infrastructure was vast. The engineering talent was deep. The resources were real, but no amount of infrastructure could change the physics. The specification the Navy had written demanded a machine that should not have been possible. Horikoshi's job was to make it possible anyway. Jiro Horikoshi was born on June 22, 1903 near the city of Fujioka in Gunma Prefecture, northeast of Tokyo. He grew up watching airplanes transition from curiosity to strategic necessity. By the time he reached university, the future of national power was being written in the sky. He enrolled at the University of Tokyo and graduated in 1927 from the newly established Aviation Laboratory within the engineering department, one of the first cohorts trained specifically for aircraft design. He joined Mitsubishi immediately and began his career at the Nagoya Works. His first project was the 1MF-10, an experimental carrier fighter that never passed the prototype stage. It flew. It did not fly well. The landing gear was weak. The handling was poor. The project failed. But Horikoshi learned from the failure the way all serious engineers learn from failure, not as a setback, but as data. The lessons fed directly into his next design. In the mid-1930s, Horikoshi led the development of the A5M, a carrier fighter he designed from the ground up. The A5M was a clean, low-winged monoplane with fixed landing gear and an open cockpit. It was light, fast, and extraordinarily maneuverable. It entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy and immediately proved itself over China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese pilots flying the A5M against Chinese Air Force fighters, many of them Soviet-built, reported decisive advantages in speed and agility. The A5M could outturn anything it faced. It established Horikoshi's reputation as the foremost fighter designer in Japan. When the 12-shy specification arrived in 1937, the Navy did not wonder who should lead the project, but Mitsubishi's management hesitated. The company was already occupied with a Navy bomber contract. The executives considered rejecting the fighter specification entirely. They had the A5M in production. They had bomber orders to fill. Taking on an impossible specification for a fighter that might never work was a risk the business side was not eager to accept. Horikoshi pressed hard. He argued that his team could meet the performance demands if they were allowed to pursue an extreme weight reduction strategy. He argued that the fighter contract was more important than the bomber. The Navy agreed. The bomber project was shelved. Horikoshi was given the design team and the resources. His engineers went to work in the Nagoya plant. The project that Nakajima had declared impossible was now the responsibility of one man and his team. The central problem was weight. Every requirement in the specification demanded a performance that only a lighter aircraft could deliver. More range meant more fuel, which added weight. More armament meant heavier guns and ammunition, which added weight. The heavier the aircraft became, the more powerful the engine needed to be, and more powerful engines were heavier. The spiral was vicious and self-reinforcing. The only way to break it was to remove weight from every other part of the airplane. With a discipline that bordered on obsession, Horikoshi understood this immediately. He also understood the price. He made a decision that would define both the triumph and the tragedy of the machine he was about to create. He stripped the aircraft of protective armor. No steel plate behind the pilot's seat. No protection around the fuel tanks. No self-sealing bladders to close bullet holes and prevent fuel leaks. Every Western fighter under development in the late 1930s was adding these survivability features. The Americans were adding them. The British were adding them. The Germans were adding them. Horikoshi removed them before they were ever installed. The reasoning was precise. Japanese aero engines in the late 1930s produced 20 to 30% less power than their American and European equivalents. Horikoshi himself acknowledged this gap. The only way to match or exceed Western fighter performance with an inferior engine was to build an airframe so light that the engine's disadvantage became irrelevant. He used a new aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin, designated T7178. It was stronger than standard aircraft aluminum, which allowed thinner structural members, which saved weight at every joint, rib, and spar throughout the airframe. The wings were built using a single continuous spar design with integral fuel tanks built into the wing structure. The fuselage was assembled in two major sections joined by a ring of 80 bolts. Engine, cockpit, and wing formed one rigid unit. The tail section formed the other two pieces. The construction method was revolutionary. It simplified manufacturing and saved weight simultaneously. The result was an aircraft with an empty weight of approximately 3,704 pounds. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the American carrier fighter it would face in combat, weighed 5,758 pounds empty. The Zero was nearly a ton lighter than its primary adversary. That gap was not an accident. It was Horikoshi's answer. On April 1, 1939, the first prototype lifted off the runway at Kagamigahara Airfield near Nagoya. The test pilot was Katsuzo Shima. Horikoshi watched from the ground. The aircraft climbed fast. It turned tight. The controls were responsive and balanced at every speed. Flight testing continued through the spring and summer. A second prototype was built with the more powerful Nakajima Sakai 12 engine, a 14-cylinder radial producing 940 horsepower. The performance numbers with the new engine were extraordinary. Maximum speed reached 331 mph at 15,000 feet. The aircraft could climb to 9,800 feet in 3 minutes and 30 seconds, meeting the Navy's most demanding requirement almost exactly. Its range with an external drop tank exceeded 1,600 miles. No carrier-based fighter anywhere in the world approached those numbers. No land-based fighter matched the combination of range, speed, and agility. The Navy accepted the aircraft for service in July 1940, the Japanese year 2600. The last 2 digits of that year gave the fighter its official designation, Navy Type Zero Carrier Fighter. The pilots called it Ryzen. The world would call it the Zero. The Zero's combat debut was not at Pearl Harbor. It was over China more than a year before the Pacific War began. In September 1940, 13 A6M Zeros based at Hankou escorted a formation of bombers on a mission to Chongqing. 27 Chinese Air Force fighters intercepted them, a mix of Soviet-built Polikarpov I-15 biplanes and I-16 monoplanes. The engagement lasted minutes. The Zeros destroyed every Chinese fighter in the air, all 27. They did not lose a single aircraft. The kill ratio was absolute. Reports of the engagement reached Western intelligence services. They were dismissed. American and British military analysts assumed the reports were exaggerated or fabricated. They assumed a carrier-based Japanese fighter could not possibly outperform land-based opposition from the Soviet Union. The assumptions were built on a foundation of racial prejudice and technological arrogance that had calcified into doctrine. Western analysts believed Japanese industry was fundamentally incapable of producing a world-class combat aircraft. Some believed Japanese pilots were physically inferior, hampered by poor eyesight. These beliefs were not grounded in evidence. They were grounded in contempt. Claire Chennault, the American advisor to the Chinese Air Force who would later lead the Flying Tigers, sent specific and detailed warnings about the Zero's capabilities to Washington. The warnings were ignored. The contempt would cost thousands of lives. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the opening move of a campaign that spanned the entire Western Pacific and Indian Oceans simultaneously. The strike force that hit Hawaii included 420 aircraft launched from 6 carriers. Among them were 126 A6M Zeros, flying fighter escort and strafing missions. The Zeros swept the skies over Oahu. American fighters that managed to get airborne were outclassed and destroyed. On the same day, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines, Malaya, Wake Island, Guam, and Hong Kong. The Zero was present at every engagement. Over the Philippines, Zeros destroyed most of the United States Army Air Force's Far East Air Force, both on the ground and in the air. Over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they outfought everything the Allies could put up. Brewster Buffaloes, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, Curtiss Hawk 75s, Hawker Hurricanes. In the skies over the Dutch East Indies alone, Zeros accounted for the destruction of roughly 550 Allied aircraft during the campaign. Over Burma, the same pattern repeated. Over Ceylon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged, 60 British aircraft, and destroyed 27 of them while losing a single fighter. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved a kill ratio that military historians estimate at approximately 12 to 1. 12. Allied aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. The fighter owned the sky from the Central Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Allied pilots who survived encounters with the Zero reported the same thing. It was faster, it climbed faster, it turned tighter, it stayed in the air longer. Nothing in the Allied inventory could match it in a conventional dogfight. Japan's most skilled pilots exploited the Zero's capabilities with devastating effect. Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's leading surviving ace of the Pacific War with 64 credited aerial victories, flew the Zero throughout the campaign. He described the aircraft as an extension of his own body, a machine so responsive that the boundary between pilot and airplane dissolved in combat. The Zero's controls were light, its visibility excellent through the large greenhouse canopy, and its rate of roll at low speeds made it nearly impossible to track in a turning fight. The men who had dismissed the intelligence reports from China were now reading the same reports written over their own burning airfields. But the math that had served Horikoshi so brilliantly had a second ledger. Every gram of weight he had removed to achieve the Zero's performance was a gram of protection the pilot did not have. The same design philosophy that made the Zero untouchable in a turning fight made it catastrophically vulnerable when hit. A burst of machine gun fire that would damage an American Wildcat and allow the pilot to nurse the aircraft home would ignite a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks and kill the pilot instantly. The aircraft had no armor behind the seat. A single rifle-caliber round entering the cockpit from the rear could kill the pilot without damaging the airframe. The self-sealing fuel tanks that American and British engineers considered essential were absent from the design entirely. A bullet that pierced the Zero's fuel tank opened a hole that stayed open. Fuel poured out. It ignited. The airplane burned. American pilots who fought the Zero in the first months of the war and survived learned this vulnerability quickly. The machine was superior in every performance metric except one: it could not absorb damage. It was a sword with no shield. The trade-off was Horikoshi's bargain with physics. He had purchased performance with vulnerability. In the early months, when the Zero held the initiative, when it attacked from above and dictated the terms of every engagement, the bargain paid handsomely. A fighter that cannot be hit does not need armor. But wars do not stay on the attacker's terms forever. The moment the Zero found itself on the defensive, the moment an opponent put rounds into the airframe, the bargain reversed. Every gram of weight that had been saved became a gram of catastrophe. The turning point arrived in stages. The first stage was tactical. Before any new American fighter reached the Pacific, pilots developed methods to fight the Zero with the machines they already had. The critical insight was simple. Do not turn with a Zero. Never engage in a slow-speed turning fight. Use altitude. Use speed, dive on it, fire, and extend away. The Thack Weave, devised by Lieutenant Commander John Thack before Pearl Harbor, based on intelligence reports from China, formalized this into a two-plane defensive tactic. Two fighters flew in a weaving pattern. When a Zero attacked one, the other turned into the attacker and fired. The tactic neutralized the Zero's turning advantage by refusing to play the Zero's game. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Thack used the weave against Zeros for the first time in combat. It worked. The tactic spread through the fleet. The second stage was intelligence. On June 4, 1942, the same day the Battle of Midway began, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadaoshi Koga was attacking the American base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. His Zero's oil line was severed by ground fire. He attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island. The aircraft flipped on the soft marshy ground. Koga was killed, but the airframe remained nearly intact. American forces recovered the aircraft a month later. They repaired it, they flew it. For the first time, American test pilots measured the Zero's exact performance envelope. Its rate of climb at every altitude, its turning radius at every speed, its roll rate, its dive limits. The tests confirmed what combat pilots already suspected. The Zero was superior in low-speed turning and rate of climb. It was inferior in high-speed dives, in roll rate above 200 knots, and in structural integrity under negative G loads. The diagnosis was precise. The prescription was clear. The third stage was industrial. The United States did what Horikoshi's Japan could not. It built entirely new fighters designed to exploit every weakness the captured Zero had revealed. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in mid-1943. It was heavier than the Zero. It was faster. It was armored. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. It had an engine producing 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's power. The Vought F-4U Corsair entered the Pacific with similar advantages, even faster than the Hellcat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was already in theater, devastating at altitude with twin engines and concentrated firepower. By mid-1943, the Zero was no longer the best fighter in the Pacific. It was not the second best. Every new American type outperformed it in the metrics that now determine survival: speed, dive performance, firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment and bring the pilot home alive. Horikoshi knew the Zero was being overtaken. He had begun work on successors. The J2M Raiden, a land-based interceptor designed for speed and climb rate. The A7M Repu, intended to replace the Zero as a carrier fighter. Neither arrived in time. The J2M was plagued by engine problems and produced in limited numbers. The A7M never entered production before the war ended. Japan's industrial base, battered by American strategic bombing and strangled by submarine blockades, severing its supply of raw materials, oil and rubber, could not produce new designs at the speed the war demanded. Mitsubishi's Nagoya works was a priority target for B-29 raids. The factory complex that had built the Zero was being systematically destroyed from the air. By 1944, the Zero was obsolete. Japanese pilots knew it. Their commanders knew it. The aircraft that had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 was being slaughtered in every major engagement. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 550 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zeros in that battle were slower, unarmored, and flown by pilots with weeks of training where their predecessors had had years. Japan's experienced aviators, the men who had mastered the Zero over China and Pearl Harbor, and the Dutch East Indies were dead. They had been killed at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at Rabaul, in the grinding air war over the Solomon Islands. The pilots who replaced them barely knew how to land on a carrier. The combination of an obsolete fighter and an undertrained pilot corps was fatal on a strategic scale. Beginning in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy began using Zeros as kamikaze aircraft. The fighter Horikoshi had designed to outperform every opponent in the sky, was loaded with a 550,000 lb bomb, and deliberately crashed into American ships. More Zeros were expended in kamikaze attacks than any other aircraft type during the final year of the war. The engineer who had built the most agile fighter in the world watched his creation used as a guided missile piloted by boys. Horikoshi was privately devastated. His diary entries published decades later reveal a man who believed Japan's war was futile and suicidal from its inception. He wrote that Japan was being driven to doom. He had designed the Zero because it was his job and because the engineering problem consumed him entirely. He had not designed it to be thrown away. He wrote in his diary that he and his colleagues had been convinced that the government would find a diplomatic resolution before the situation became catastrophic. Instead, bereft of any strong move to seek a way out, Japan was being driven to doom. The man who had built the instrument of Japan's greatest aerial victories was watching it consumed in the fires of Japan's greatest defeat. In total, Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and other subcontractors produced 10,939 Zeros between 1939 and 1945. It was the most produced Japanese aircraft of the entire war. The fighter that had shocked the world over China and swept the skies over Pearl Harbor ended its life as a weapon of desperation. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama had been burned to rubble by incendiary bombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been struck with atomic weapons. The population was starving. American occupation forces arrived and immediately began dismantling the industrial structures that had powered Japan's war machine. The Zaibatsu were the first target. In 1946, the Allied occupation government ordered the dissolution of the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the largest private company in Japan, was broken into 3 entities: West Japan Heavy Industries, Central Japan Heavy Industries, and East Japan Heavy Industries. Aircraft production was forbidden entirely. The factories that had built the Zero were converted to civilian manufacturing. The engineers who had designed the most advanced carrier fighter in the world were now building scooters. A small motorized two-wheeler called the Silver Pigeon rolled off the same lines that had assembled fighters capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean. Bus production resumed. 3-wheeled cargo vehicles appeared. The workforce that had built 11,000 warplanes was making delivery trucks. Jiro Horikoshi stopped designing aircraft. Japan was prohibited from all aviation development under the terms of the occupation. The man who had designed the most capable carrier fighter in the history of naval aviation had nothing to design. He waited, but the prohibition did not last forever. The occupation ended in 1952. The ban on the Mitsubishi name was lifted. The three successor companies began reintegrating. In 1964, they formally reunited as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The company was whole again. During the years of separation, Central Japan Heavy Industries had developed automotive manufacturing capability. It assembled Willys Jeeps under license for the Japanese market. It built commercial trucks. The post-war Japanese economy was expanding at a pace that astonished the world. Roads were being built. Consumers who had never owned a car were buying their first. In 1960, Shin Mitsubishi released the Mitsubishi 500, a compact rear-engine sedan with a 493 cubic centimeter two-cylinder engine, producing just 21 horsepower. It was small, light, and engineered with a precision that its modest specifications did not suggest. It was the first true passenger car from the company that had once built Zeros. The car weighed just 490 kilograms. The engineers who had spent their careers eliminating every unnecessary gram from fighter airframes applied the same discipline to automobile bodies. The 500 sold well in a domestic market hungry for affordable personal transportation. By 1970, the automobile division had grown large enough to operate on its own. On April 22, 1970, Mitsubishi Motors Corporation was formally spun off as an independent company. The engineering culture that had built carrier fighters was now building cars. The discipline of weight reduction, the obsession with structural efficiency, the institutional knowledge of engines and metallurgy and aerodynamics that Horikoshi and his generation had embedded in the Nagoya works transferred directly into automobile design. The factories that had produced airframes now produced car bodies. The engineers who had calculated stress loads on wing spars calculated stress loads on suspension arms. Mitsubishi Motors expanded rapidly through the 1970s and 1980s, building sedans, pickup trucks, and sport utility vehicles. The company developed a reputation for rugged, over-engineered vehicles that performed in conditions where competitors failed. It entered motorsport with ferocious commitment. Mitsubishi's Pajero dominated the Dakar Rally. Its Lancer Evolution became one of the most successful rally cars in history. The engineering DNA was unmistakable. The same culture that had produced a fighter capable of flying 1,600 miles from a carrier engaging in combat and returning produced vehicles designed to cross deserts, climb mountains, and endure punishment that would destroy lesser machines. By the early 2000s, Mitsubishi Motors was selling vehicles in more than 160 countries. The company that had built the Zero was now the fourth largest automaker in Japan. Horikoshi lived to see all of it. After the occupation lifted, he participated in the design of the NAMC YS-11, a turboprop airliner built by a Japanese government consortium. It was the first Japanese-designed commercial aircraft since the war. More than 180 were built. Airlines across Asia and South America flew them. The project proved that Japanese aviation engineering had not been destroyed by the war and the occupation. It had only been interrupted. When the project ended, Horikoshi left Mitsubishi and devoted himself to teaching and writing. He lectured at universities across Japan. In 1970, he published his memoir, a meticulous account of the Zero's development from the first specification to the last production model. It was translated into English in 1981 as Eagles of Mitsubishi, the story of the Zero fighter. The book revealed a man consumed by the engineering and tormented by its application. He had wanted to build the perfect airplane. He succeeded. The perfect airplane was used to wage a war he believed would destroy his country. In the autumn of 1973, the Japanese government awarded Horikoshi the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, for his contributions to aviation. On January 11, 1982, Jiro Horikoshi died of pneumonia in a Tokyo hospital. He was 78 years old. His obituary appeared in major newspapers around the world, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. He left behind 5 children. None of them became engineers. In 2013, the legendary Japanese filmmaker Hayao Miyazaki released The Wind Rises, a fictionalized animated film based loosely on Horikoshi's life. The film portrayed a dreamer consumed by the beauty of flight and haunted by the destruction his creations enabled. It was a portrait of the tension that defined Horikoshi's entire career. the man who loved airplanes, the man who hated the war they fought. Today, the Mitsubishi Group encompasses hundreds of companies spanning every major industry on Earth. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries builds gas turbines, rocket launch vehicles, naval destroyers, and air defense systems. Mitsubishi Motors produces automobiles sold on 6 continents. Mitsubishi Electric manufactures everything from industrial robots to satellite systems. Mitsubishi Corporation is one of the world's largest general trading companies. The 3-diamond logo appears on nuclear power plants and air conditioners, on cargo ships and sedan dashboards, on space launch vehicles and lithium-ion batteries. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries alone employs over 77,000 people and generates annual revenues exceeding 4.6 trillion yen. It manufactures the rockets that launch Japanese satellites into orbit. It builds the gas turbines that power cities across Asia. It constructs the naval vessels that patrol the seas Japan once tried to conquer. The engineering lineage from Horikoshi's design office to the modern aerospace division is direct and unbroken. The combined revenue of the Mitsubishi Group runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. The workforce exceeds 1 million people. The company that Yataro Iwasaki founded as a shipping venture with government contracts in 1870 survived imperial expansion, total war, atomic destruction, foreign occupation, corporate dismemberment by decree, and economic rebirth. It is still here. The Zero was not the best fighter of the Second World War. By 1943, it was not even the best fighter in the Pacific. Its design philosophy created a machine that was devastating when it held the initiative and catastrophically vulnerable when it lost it. The armor Horikoshi removed to save weight was the armor that would have kept his pilots alive when the war turned against them. The self-sealing tanks he never installed would have prevented thousands of cockpit fires. The Zero's genius and its tragedy were the same decision. It was an aircraft designed for a short war by a nation that could not survive a long one. The war was long. The design could not evolve fast enough to survive it. But Horikoshi's engineering was never the failure. The engineering was extraordinary. A carrier fighter with the range of a medium bomber, the agility of a racing plane, and an engine 20 to 30% less powerful than anything its enemies flew. That machine should not have existed. The specification that produced it was declared impossible by Nakajima, one of Japan's most capable manufacturers. Horikoshi built it anyway. He built it by asking one question of every component, every rivet, every structural member. Where can I remove weight, he kept asking until the machine weighed less than anything his opponents believed was achievable. The answer created a fighter that ruled the Pacific. And when the war consumed everything he had built, the same discipline, the same obsession with engineering excellence, built something else entirely. The factory survived, the engineers survived, the culture survived. The machines changed, the habit did not. If this story of engineering defiance and industrial rebirth changed how you look at the machines that shape our world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the history they tried to bury. Let's plant the seeds of the future together. The next treasure from our historical vault will be open soon.